The traveler had walked far that day. The road twisted through cedar groves and damp ravines until it reached a waterfall that spilled like silk into a quiet pool. The hour was late. The sun had surrendered, and the moon hung pale above the mist. He thought himself alone, yet the air felt thick, as if unseen eyes lingered. Then he saw her. A woman, seated on a rock near the water, her long hair cascading like ink, her robe gleaming with impossible brilliance in the silver light. She lifted her head slowly, and when her gaze met his, it was as though the world itself paused. Her voice, soft and fluid, invited him closer. It was not the voice of a stranger, but of someone who seemed to know him already, who promised warmth against the night's chill. He stepped forward. The water rippled. For an instant, he caught a reflection that was not hers, not slender arms, but countless limbs, delicate and spindly, reaching out from her body like strands of silk. He blinked, and the illusion was gone. She smiled reassuringly, tenderly, and he doubted his own eyes. Thus begins the tale of Jorōgumo, the binding bride, the woman who is also a spider. She is both seduction and snare, a creature whose love is indistinguishable from entrapment, whose embrace ends not in union, but in death. The Jorōgumo is a creature born from the weavings of Japanese folklore. Her story traced back through centuries of whispered fears and written chronicles. In its simplest form, the name means entangling bride or whore spider. But the truth is more complex. She is not a grotesque beast lurking in shadows, but a paradox, a being of beauty and horror, intimacy and betrayal. According to tradition, an ordinary golden orb weaver spider, when it lives to the age of 400 years, transforms into this supernatural being. Time grants her not decay, but elegance. She sheds the limits of her small body and dons the form of a woman so captivating that no man can resist her. She moves with grace, her kimono shimmering, her voice a lullaby in the dark. Yet within her lies the hunger of a predator, and the silken threads of her web are spun not in corners, but in hearts. The Edo-period, 1603 to 1868, when towns grew, roads connected villages, and the floating world of entertainment and pleasure thrived, the Jorōgumo emerged as a perfect metaphor. She was both a literal monster and a reflection of society's unease. To some, she was a warning against the dangers of fleeting pleasure, courtesans, and the lures of the red light districts. To others, she was a reminder that behind every promise of beauty lurked risk, that desire could bind as tightly as a spider's silk. Her legends placed her near waterfalls, forests, and remote villages, liminal places where the ordinary world blurred with the supernatural. The most famous site is Joren Falls in Izu, where stories say a Jorōgumo dwelled, drawing travelers into her watery lair, binding them in silk and dragging them beneath the cascade. The fear of Jorōgumo rests not in her monstrous half, but in her disguise. She is not the grotesque demon seen from afar, but the beloved who seems too perfect to be true. In her, the Japanese imagination captured the ultimate anxiety, that the woman who smiles at you in the moonlight, who touches your hand with warmth, may not be human at all. Thus, her story endures. She is the reminder that beauty can be a mask, that desire can be a snare, that in the silk of intimacy may lie the cords of death. The Edo period, 1603 to 1868, was an age of paradox in Japan. On one hand, it was an era of peace, stability, and flourishing culture under the Tokugawa shogunate. On the other, it was an age of rigid social control, hidden desires, and strict moral codes. Within these tensions, the legend of the Jorōgumo spread, fed by anxieties about sexuality, pleasure, and the hidden dangers of beauty. The floating world. Cities like Edo, modern Tokyo, Kyoto, and Osaka pulsed with life. The so-called ukiyo, or floating world, was a culture of fleeting pleasures, kabuki theaters, tea houses, and red light districts. Courtesans and entertainers became central figures in this urban landscape. They were admired, desired, even celebrated, but they were also feared. Behind every painted smile lay the risk of ruin, debts, diseases, heartbreak, or social disgrace. It was in this world that the Jorōgumo took shape as more than a monster. She became an allegory. Her silken snares echoed the entanglements of desire in the entertainment quarters, where men were drawn willingly into webs of passion that might leave them broken. Just as the Spider Woman drained her victims slowly, so too could courtesans, through charm and contract, drain a man's wealth, time, and spirit. Women, power, and suspicion. In Edo society, women were tightly bound by Confucian ideals of obedience and restraint. A proper woman was a daughter, wife, and mother, dutiful, modest, and domestic. But the Jorōgumo was none of these things. She lived alone, independent, free to choose her prey. She was beautiful not for service or family, but for her own power. Such independence was unsettling. A woman who stood outside of the expected roles was dangerous. Rumors attached themselves to widows, to solitary women in remote houses, to courtesans who wielded unusual influence over men. The Jorōgumo embodied this fear, the suspicion that a woman's beauty, unrestrained by social bonds, could ensnare and destroy. The spider as a symbol. The spider itself carried symbolic weight. In Japanese folklore, spiders were both admired for their skill and feared for their cunning. Their webs, intricate and invisible, mirrored the hidden entanglements of human life. To fall into a web was to be trapped by threads too delicate to notice until it was too late. The orb weaver, whose name Jorōgumo literally references, was especially symbolic. Its bright, patterned body and patient hunting style made it a fitting metaphor for beauty that conceals danger. When storytellers imagined such a spider transformed into a woman, the metaphor became flesh, a lure entwined with death. Fear of desire. In a society where sexuality was tightly regulated, the Jorōgumo gave voice to unspoken fears. Men knew the dangers of visiting tea houses or red light districts, but stories allowed these fears to be expressed without direct accusation. A tale of a spider woman who drained men at waterfalls or in lonely inns was safer than a sermon against courtesans. Folklore became a mask, just as the woman was a mask for the spider. The Jorōgumo's allure reflected the forbidden. Her beauty promised not duty or marriage, but intimacy outside society's rules. In this sense, she was not only terrifying, but thrilling, a figure of temptation as much as fear. Waterfalls and wild places. It is no accident that many legends place the Jorōgumo near waterfalls, rivers, or remote forests. These were liminal spaces, thresholds between safety and danger, civilization and wilderness. To travel there was already to risk danger. and so the tales magnified it with supernatural dread. The most famous is Jordan Falls in Izu. Locals warned travelers that a beautiful woman might appear there, inviting them to rest. Those who followed found themselves bound in silk, their bodies discovered days later in the depths of the pool. To this day, signs near the falls recall her legend, blending folklore with geography, myth with place. A living allegory. Thus, in the Edo period, the Jorōgumo was more than a monster. She was a living allegory of society's contradictions, the allure of pleasure versus the duty of restraint, the power of women versus the control of patriarchy, the promise of intimacy versus the danger of ruin. Her story was whispered not only in fear, but in recognition. She was the shadow side of the floating world, the embodiment of what men desired and dreaded at once.
The essence of the Jorōgumo legend lies in transformation. She is not merely a woman, nor merely a spider, but the unsettling fusion of both. Her power rests in her ability to cross the line between beauty and monstrosity, to conceal her true form until it is too late. To speak of her is to speak of masks, of appearances that shift, of truths hidden beneath silk and shadow. The shape of seduction. When the Jorōgumo chooses to hunt, she appears not as a creature of horror, but as the perfect vision of human beauty. Her hair, long and dark, glistens in the moonlight. Her kimono rustles like flowing water. She speaks softly, her laughter light, her eyes glimmering with the warmth of familiarity. To meet her is to feel a pull, an unnameable recognition, as though one has always known her. But behind this flawless disguise lies the patience of a predator. The beauty is a mask, spun as carefully as a web. Her presence is tailored to desire. To the lonely traveler who longs for company, she is tender. To the young samurai full of pride, she is respectful. To the weary farmer, she is gentle and comforting. She is every man's ideal because her form bends to match the longing in his heart. The hidden body. Legends often describe the moment when the illusion shatters. Sometimes it is a glimpse in the reflection of water. The woman's shadow shows not hands, but spindly legs, stretching and curling. Sometimes it is the sudden sound of silk threads snapping in the air, invisible cords tightening around the victim's limbs. At other times, the beauty simply melts away, her body elongating, her limbs splitting into 8, her face stretching into something both human and arachnid. Yet the horror is never presented crudely. The Jorōgumo is not a grotesque beast from the start. She is a seduction made monstrous only at the last. Her true form is revealed when escape is no longer possible. That is the essence of her power, the delay between desire and doom. The symbol of the web. Her dual image reflects the symbolism of the spider's web. A web is nearly invisible until it ensnares you. It glitters beautifully in the morning dew, a delicate work of art, but it is also a trap, its beauty inseparable from its deadliness. So it is with the Jorōgumo. Her human form is a web of charm, shimmering and irresistible. To enter her presence is to step into the strands. By the time one realizes, the threads have already closed. The feminine mystique. There is a reason why the Jorōgumo became a distinctly feminine spirit. In Edo society, the ideal woman was restrained, modest, silent. Yet here was a figure who embodied the opposite, independent, confident, radiant with power. Her beauty was not meant to please or to serve. It was a weapon, sharpened and honed. To some, she represented the fantasy of female autonomy. To others, the nightmare of it. This ambiguity deepened her allure. Was she a monster to be feared or a goddess to be admired? Was her embrace a curse, or was it the inevitable price of desire? The stories rarely answer. Instead, they leave the listener suspended in her web, caught between fear and longing. Transformation as a metaphor. The transformation of the spider into a woman was itself a metaphor for the hidden lives of desire. A small, overlooked creature, lowly, unremarkable, suddenly becomes a force of irresistible attraction. It was a reflection of the courtesan's art, of how ordinary women could, through makeup, dress, and performance, become figures of power who commanded the attention of men from every class. In this way, the Jorōgumo was not simply supernatural, she was social commentary disguised as myth. Her shifting forms reflected the shifting roles of women, the blurred lines between fantasy and reality, and the dangers of confusing appearance with truth. Beauty and horror united. Perhaps what makes the Jorōgumo unforgettable is not her monstrosity, but her elegance. Even when revealed as a spider, she is not always described as grotesque. Her silk is gleaming, her movements graceful, her patience mesmerizing. She is both dreadful and divine, embodying the paradox of beauty itself, that which attracts, entices, and ultimately destroys. In her, the Japanese imagination found a figure who could never be simplified. She was not simply a monster, nor simply a warning. She was a mirror, reflecting the desires and fears of a society caught between repression and temptation. The Jorōgumo's true weapon was never her fangs nor her venom. It was her beauty. In tale after tale, what doomed her victims was not brute force, but the willingness with which they followed her. She was less a predator who pounced than an enchantress who invited. Desire was her snare, and longing the silk with which she bound. The approach. A lone traveler pauses at the edge of a forest. The light is fading, the road seems endless, and then he hears a voice, gentle, feminine, calling him as though by name. Emerging from the mist is a woman so radiant that he doubts his own eyes. She does not rush to him, she waits. She tilts her head, offering a smile both kind and knowing. This was the Jorōgumo's first lesson. Let the prey come willingly. Like a spider that does not chase, but waits in its web, she stood where men would find her irresistible. A waterfall's edge, a lonely roadside inn, a shrine half forgotten in the woods. These became her stage, and men, weary or prideful or lonely, stepped forward of their own accord. Words as silk. Once near, the Jorōgumo wove her silk not with hands, but with words. She spoke with the tenderness of an old companion, as though she had always been waiting. For the warrior, she praised her bravery. For the merchant, she admired her wit. For the farmer, she spoke of simple joys, of warmth and food and rest. Her words had the weight of prophecy. She seemed to know what they craved before they themselves could speak it. Each phrase wrapped tighter, each glance another strand. By the time a man realized he had confided in her, revealed his fears or desires, he was already ensnared, not by force, but by intimacy. The power of touch. The moment of contact was always described with reverence. A hand brushing a sleeve, a smile lingering too long, eyes meeting beneath moonlight. These gestures carried no violence, only promise. The horror lay not in sudden attack, but in the way such small touches erased caution. In the intimacy of a shared glance or whispered secret, men forgot the strangeness of the night, forgot their doubts, forgot themselves.
Just as a spider lulls its prey with stillness before binding it, so too did the Jorōgumo lull with gentleness. Her victims leaned closer not out of fear, but trust. To them, she was not a stranger, but the answer to their solitude. The illusion of safety. The greatest cruelty of the Jorōgumo was the illusion of safety. She did not appear as a threat. She appeared as a companion, a lover, a confidant. Men followed her not because they were ensnared, but because they believed themselves chosen. To walk beside her through the forest or sit with her beside the waterfall felt like grace. But within that illusion, the silken cords tightened invisibly. Legends tell of men found days later, wrapped in threads, their bodies pale, their faces still marked with the serenity of those who had gone willingly. Death in her embrace was slow but almost tender. The dance of desire. To call her methods seduction is to miss the depth of the metaphor. The Jorōgumo was not only luring men to death, she was embodying the dangers of unchecked longing. She reflected the truth that desire, once awakened, often leads us willingly into snares. The spider woman did not need to strike because her prey struck the bargain themselves. They leaned in, they followed, they surrendered. This was why her tales endured, because they were less about monsters in the night and more about the monsters within, about how loneliness, pride, and yearning could undo even the strongest. A web of echoes. Every culture has its enchantresses, the sirens of Greece, the succubi of medieval Europe, the rusalki of Slavic rivers. But the Jorōgumo is uniquely Japanese in her subtlety. She does not sing sailors to their doom or descend in fiery temptation. She waits by the water. She speaks gently. She listens. She kills not by force, but by letting men believe they are safe, even loved. Her seduction is horror precisely because it feels so close to love.
The stories of Jorōgumo always revolve around her chosen prey. Like every predator, she was selective. Her victims were not random. They reflected the anxieties and vulnerabilities of Edo society. Each tale whispered not just of a supernatural encounter, but of the kinds of people most likely to fall, those whose weaknesses matched her web. The lonely travelers. The most common prey were travelers, merchants, pilgrims, or wanderers who found themselves far from home. Roads in Edo, Japan were long and treacherous, lined with forests and mountains where danger lurked, both natural and supernatural. A traveler who encountered a beautiful woman at night, graceful, welcoming, offering warmth, was almost fated to follow. Loneliness was their undoing. Far from family and familiarity, their guard lowered. The Jorōgumo thrived in these moments, stepping into the role of the companion they yearned for. Legends tell of men never arriving at their destinations, their belongings discovered near waterfalls or shrines, their absence explained in whispers. He must have met her. The proud samurai. Another favored target was the young warrior, proud and restless. For the samurai, whose lives were governed by duty and honor, encounters with mysterious women carried a thrill. To be chosen by beauty was a validation of their strength, their charm, their manhood. The Jorōgumo knew how to feed such pride. She bowed respectfully, spoke admirably of their prowess, and drew them into conversations where they revealed their ambitions. In her presence, the warrior ceased to be a servant of his lord and became a man desired for himself. But this was the illusion. While he basked in her admiration, her threads were already tightening. Pride
blinded him to danger. The tales suggest that for the samurai, death in her arms was less a struggle than a surrender. The young and reckless. Folklore also speaks of youths, boys barely men, hungry for adventure, intoxicated by the allure of the forbidden. They were easy prey, dazzled by her beauty, unable to distinguish between passion and peril. For them, the Jorōgumo embodied fantasy itself, the mysterious woman who appeared suddenly, who promised intimacy beyond their experience, who seemed to choose them out of all the world. Their eagerness made resistance impossible. They walked into her lair with smiles, never suspecting that their desire was the very bait she offered. The married and the faithless. Some tales whisper of men who strayed from their families. Farmers or merchants with wives at home, they still sought novelty, still followed when a woman of striking beauty beckoned. For them, the Jorōgumo was both temptation and punishment. She offered what they sought in secrecy, but secrecy was her web. These stories often carried a moral edge. Communities used them as warnings. Straying men might not return, their absence explained not by shame, but by supernatural justice. The Spider Woman thus became both seductress and enforcer, embodying society's condemnation of betrayal. The rare woman victim. Though rare, there are also accounts of women falling prey. In these stories, the Jorōgumo appears not as a rival, but as a friend, someone offering comfort or companionship. The silk threads of intimacy are not always romantic. Sometimes they are woven of trust. In these tales, too, the victim realizes too late that the one she leaned on was not human at all. Why these victims? The pattern is clear. The Jorōgumo preyed on those who carried within them a need: loneliness, pride, desire, restlessness. She did not chase the strong, the content, the fulfilled. She chose those who were already hungry for something more. In this, her legend revealed a truth, that danger comes not from without, but from within, from the gaps in our own hearts. The silent lesson. By naming these victims, the stories carried warnings. Travelers were reminded to remain cautious, samurai to guard against pride, youths against recklessness, husbands against betrayal. Every victim was not only a person, but a lesson. The Jorōgumo was not simply a monster who killed. She was a mirror showing society its weakest places. Her victims were reflections of the dangers people most feared in themselves. In the whispers of folklore, the Jorōgumo's power was not only to appear beautiful, but to promise the deepest intimacy. Her stories are filled not with sudden violence, but with slow enchantment. Evenings stretched into eternity, moments where tenderness and terror became indistinguishable. The promise of desire. When men followed her, they did not imagine death. They imagined closeness, warmth, the fulfillment of secret longing. She offered companionship without judgment, affection without demand. For the weary traveler, this was irresistible. To be held, to be wanted, to feel that in the darkness of the world, someone had chosen them. This was her genius. Unlike demons who struck from shadows, the Jorōgumo gave her victims what they most craved: to share food, to laugh softly, to sit beside her under the moon. These moments carried the sweetness of love. Her victims surrendered, not out of fear, but out of desire. The illusion of love. Legends speak of men who lived with her for days, even weeks, believing themselves in the company of a gentle lover. They told of nights filled with music, her voice singing quietly, or with touch, soft as silk. But all the while, unseen threads bound tighter around them. Their strength ebbed, their bodies grew pale. What they mistook for passion was in truth slow feeding. The cruelty of her seduction lay in its intimacy. She did not destroy them at once. She cherished them as though they mattered, weaving affection as carefully as she wove silk. And in that false affection, they lost themselves completely. The slow drain. Descriptions of her embrace often blurred the line between pleasure and peril. To lie beside her was to feel warmth, yet also weakness. Her kiss was said to linger, sweet at first, then cold, as though life itself was being drawn away. Some tales describe men sighing not in terror, but in surrender, whispering her name as though they loved her, even as their bodies failed. It was not the violence of a beast, but the entanglement of a lover who would never let go. That was the horror. To be destroyed not by hatred, but by devotion. The symbolism of intimacy. These tales carried layers of meaning. To common listeners, they were warnings. Beware of beauty, for beneath it may lie ruin. To more discerning ears, they hinted at deeper truths, that desire can consume, that intimacy without caution can weaken, that not all passion is safe. The Jorōgumo's sexual escapades were less about carnal indulgence and more about the peril of surrender. Her victims gave themselves willingly, believing they had found love, when in fact they had stepped into a web. The endless hunger. Yet even in these dark tales, there is an air of melancholy. The Jorōgumo did not seek wealth or conquest. She sought connection, feeding, yes, but through the mask of closeness. She was not a demon of rage, but of hunger, a hunger dressed in tenderness. And that is why the stories linger, because they reflect a truth we all know. Desire, when unchecked, can devour. Love, when false, can destroy. The dual legacy. Thus, her nights of seduction became legendary. They were recounted not as obscene tales, but as cautionary fables, rich with metaphor. To speak of her was to speak of passion's danger, of the thin line between pleasure and peril. Even today, she remains unforgettable because her horror is not in her monstrosity, but in her intimacy. She kills not by claw or fang, but by offering exactly what her victims most wanted, until it was too late to escape. Folklore does not endure simply because of monsters. It endures because it reveals something about those who tell it. The legend of the Jorōgumo was never only about a spider woman lurking in shadows. It was about the deep anxieties of Japanese society, its view of women, its suspicion of desire, its fragile balance between order and chaos. The fear of desire. In a culture built on restraint, where Confucian ideals demanded modesty and discipline, the figure of the Jorōgumo embodied what people feared within themselves. She was temptation personified. Her beauty whispered that to abandon rules, even for a night, might bring delight, but also ruin. Thus, she was not merely a creature of horror, she was a cautionary tale, reminding men that indulgence could lead to destruction. To follow her was to risk not only one's life, but one's honor, family, and place in society. The power of women. Another fear embedded in her story was the power of women beyond prescribed roles. In Edo Japan, women were expected to be dutiful daughters, faithful wives, nurturing mothers. The Jorōgumo defied all of this. She lived alone, chose her partners, and wielded power over men. Her independence was frightening because it challenged the patriarchal order. Through her, the unease surrounding courtesans and entertainers found expression. These women occupied a paradoxical place in society, celebrated for their beauty, yet distrusted for their freedom. Like the Jorōgumo, they could elevate men with affection, or ruin them with debts and broken hearts. The symbol of entanglement. At the heart of her legend is the web, delicate, invisible, impossible to escape. This symbol spoke to broader fears of entrapment. Men feared not only physical death, but the loss of autonomy, the loss of control. To be bound by love, by passion, by obligation, was itself a kind of death. The Jorōgumo embodied that terror. Her silk was both literal and metaphorical. Strands of desire, strands of intimacy, strands of dependence. Once entangled, escape was impossible. Nature as a mirror. The places associated with the Jorōgumo were themselves symbolic. Waterfalls, forests, and remote shrines were liminal spaces, thresholds between the safe and the dangerous, the human and the supernatural. To enter them was already to risk the unknown. Her presence there reflected the idea that beauty itself is liminal, a threshold between pleasure and peril. Her legend reminded listeners that the natural world was alive with spirits and dangers. A forest path was never just a path. It was a stage where human weakness met supernatural judgment. A lesson for every listener. The brilliance of the Jorōgumo tales was their adaptability. For young men, they warned against reckless passion. For travelers, they cautioned vigilance. For husbands, they whispered of fidelity. For women, they suggested the dangers of stepping outside prescribed roles. In each case, the moral was clear: beware the snares of desire, for they can lead to ruin. But there was also another, more subtle message. Beauty itself is not to be trusted. What dazzles may also destroy. What comforts may conceal a snare. Horror as reflection. Ultimately, the horror of the Jorōgumo lay not in her fangs or her silk, but in what she revealed about human nature. She showed that destruction often comes not from force, but from longing. That we are undone not by monsters in the dark, but by our willingness to step into the dark when it promises warmth. This is why her story has endured, because it reflects the timeless truth that our deepest fears are not external, but internal.
The tale of the Jorōgumo did not fade with the passing of centuries. Instead, it evolved, weaving itself into the cultural imagination of Japan and beyond. She remains alive because she embodies something universal: the mingling of beauty and fear, desire and danger, intimacy and death. In classical art and theater, during the Edo period, the Jorōgumo appeared in yokai picture scrolls, illustrated compendiums of supernatural creatures. Artists rendered her both terrifying and alluring, sometimes as a woman with strands of silk trailing from her fingers, sometimes as a spider looming behind a beautiful maiden. These images reflected the fascination of a society that feared her, but also could not look away. She also found a place in the traditional stage. In kabuki and bunraku plays, characters inspired by her appeared as femme fatales, whose beauty masked sinister intentions. In No theater, where masks and symbolism conveyed psychological depth, the Spider-Woman could be a metaphor for obsession, her threads visible only to the audience who knew the truth. In folklore sites, even today, waterfalls like Jorin Falls in Izu bear her memory. Local legends are tied to the landscape, reminding visitors that beneath the roar of the water,
something more might dwell. Signs and tourist stories keep her presence alive, blurring the line between history and myth. Travelers who stand before the falls often feel the same unease that once gripped their ancestors, the sensation of being watched, of beauty hiding danger. In modern literature and film. In modern times, the Jorōgumo has appeared in novels, short stories, and films. Contemporary horror writers draw upon her image to explore themes of seduction, betrayal, and supernatural hunger. Japanese cinema, known for its blending of the eerie and the intimate, has often invoked her as a prototype for ghostly women who are both desirable and terrifying. She also appears in manga and anime, sometimes monstrous, sometimes beautiful, sometimes both. In these forms, she is reinterpreted for new audiences, but always with her core intact: the web, the beauty, the danger. In global imagination, the Jorōgumo has even crossed borders, appearing in video games, role-playing adventures, and fantasy novels around the world. She joins the ranks of other enchantresses, sirens, succubi, witches, yet remains distinctly Japanese in her subtlety. While Western temptresses often lure with overt passion, the Jorōgumo's power lies in her quiet intimacy, her ability to seem safe until the very last moment. Why she endures. Her survival in cultural memory is no accident. It speaks to truths that never age, that desire can ensnare us, that beauty can conceal danger, that intimacy can destroy as surely as hatred. Every generation, regardless of time or place, knows these truths. And so, the Jorōgumo continues to haunt stories, screens, and imaginations. The final reflection. The Jorōgumo is not only a monster of folklore, she is a mirror. In her threads, we see the fragility of human desire, the ease with which we surrender to what we crave, the blindness that beauty can bring. Her story is not only about a spider-woman by a waterfall. It is about us, about the webs we step into willingly, the dangers we ignore because they smile at us, the truths we forget until it is too late. And so, when one stands by a rushing river at night, listening to the water's song, and glimpses a figure in the mist, a woman too beautiful, a smile too perfect, the old lesson returns. Beware the silk that shines in moonlight, for in it may wait the Jorōgumo, patient as ever, her web invisible until it is already too late.